I hope you had a good break. It was a very busy break, but I think that I will now turn to my co-host, the brilliant Julian Morris from the Reason Foundation, to help introduce the next session on free trade and clean free trade, post-World War II lessons, anti-competitive market distortions, and the agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability. And let me just say, before turning to Julian, you know, the post-World War II lesson I'll give you in about 1 minute, and that is my observation that the most successful turn to free trade in the 20th century occurred after World War II. During the Depression, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, you know, from the United States, you know, were a precipitating factor that triggered a global trade war, and international trade sank, plummeted. And that is a factor that probably was one of the contributing factors that made the Great Depression great. Post-World War II, with many of the European powers flat on their back, particularly Germany, those economies really were desperate for help. And the United States offered a package that included the Marshall Plan grants. Now, I'm not a fan, let me make clear, of state-to-state foreign aid. However, but these were part of a package that were conditioned on countries dropping their trade barriers, dropping their tariffs, and starting to enter into a process of creating open markets between countries. So I bring this up because just like the example of the IMF, you know, and the need for financing in Honduras leading to, you know, competitive energy markets, and incentive helped create the biggest liberalization of trade in the 20th century. So incentives matter, and we can probably do something much better than state-to-state foreign aid or, you know, IMF carrots. We can probably design something better than that. What that will be exactly, I'm not exactly sure, and maybe you folks can help me figure out. But as we go into our trade discussion, you know, maybe we can think about incentives as we consider clean free trade and anti-competitive market distortions. Julian, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Rod, for that introduction, which actually sort of eliminated the first sentence of what I was going to mention. So, I mean, as Rod indicated, you know, the general agreement on tariffs and trade was a key driver for reducing, especially tariffs in trade between nations, to the point where now the main barriers to trade are not really tariffs. Yes, they in some cases are still a problem, but the main barriers now are what Shankar Singham has called anti-competitive market distortions. And rather than try and define those myself, I think I'll let Shankar do that. I'll briefly introduce Shankar, who is, I think, one of the world's leading experts on both the law and the economics of trade. He worked as a practicing trade lawyer at Steele Hector Davis in the US for many years, and then returned to his home in the UK, where he worked at the Gardner Institute in London, then subsequently at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And he's now, in addition to his other affiliations, a leading advisor to the UK government, very, very deeply in the weeds on matters relating to trade and other things. And it's a really great honor to have Shankar here to talk to us, giving his perspective and might also give some indications of where the UK might go. But if you could begin, Shankar, by just quickly sort of outlining what an anti-competitive market distortion is, and then maybe give some indication as to how it might be possible going forwards to reduce those distortions through bilateral or multilateral agreements. That would be great. Do we have Shankar?
Yes, sure. Thanks very much, Julian. And it's good to be on with all of you. What I'd say, just to build on what Rod was saying and what Julian sort of spoke about, we had a long history after the Second World War of systematic reduction in tariffs, dealing with some, and then eventually through the 70s and 80s, and particularly with the Uruguay round, dealing with some other issues that relate to border distortions and border barriers. But there was a gap, and the gap was essentially what happens behind the border, and particularly regulations and other activities of government that distort markets in anti-competitive ways. So while we do have some in the WTO disciplines on domestic regulation in the context of sanitary and phytosanitary rules and technical barriers to trade to some extent, these are usually based more on the well understood and defined WTO principles of most favored nation, national treatment, and non-discrimination, but they aren't really focused on conditions of competition. Although I will say that some decisions that the WTO panels and appellate body have come down with, particularly in the area of domestic taxation, which is discriminatory, does get at the issue of have you changed the equality of competitive opportunity for certain types of products. So there is a gap here. In the Singapore round in 1997, the members of the WTO did come together and try to plug this gap. They tried to develop sort of a set of disciplines on what I've called anti-competitive market distortions. But we've not been very successful in taking this forward. Most recently, some 20 plus years on, the Japanese, the US, and the EU have put together a group on eliminating market distortions. Obviously, this is aimed, at China more than anything else, but to eliminate distortions that damage the competitive playing field. So, with respect to how this applies to this particular sector, I think if your goal is to have a more competitive market and a larger market for any product, but particularly for these kinds of products, tackling anti-competitive market distortions is going to be a key aspect of trade agreements going forward. So what is an anti-competitive market distortion? It is any government regulation, practice, or activity that distorts, or to use antitrust language, significantly lessens competition in a relevant product or geographic market. What are the remedies that we can suggest? Because it's all very well to put in disciplines in trade agreements to deal with other countries' market distortions, but an offensive-only agenda will not achieve very much. So you need some defensive measures as well. And the defensive measure that has been suggested is, and to do it in a WTO compliant way, but to consider, as opposed to the Trump administration approach on China, which is a big tariff that's not really related to the size of the Chinese distortion, is actually to have a tarification, as it were, of the distortion that is actually linked to the scale of the distortion, which gives the country that's doing the distorting an incentive to lower its distortion. It has a choice. You maintain the distortion and continue to pay for it, or lower the distortion, and then the tarification goes away. But it isn't going to be easy. This is not like a trade remedy action. It's not like an anti-dumping countervailing duty action where it's very easy to bring a case, and once a case has been brought, it's almost impossible to get rid of the tariff. In this case, the parties would have to demonstrate that there is a distortion, demonstrate that it has an anti-competitive effect, which is not going to be easy to do. And they will also have to demonstrate causation and damage, and those things are not necessarily that easy to do either. So those are the kinds of things that you would bring in to this. Offensively, you would want to make sure that countries that are distorting markets in ways that either in favor of incumbent technology companies, incumbent producers, which often obviously occurs, or they're doing it in other ways to use subsidies or other means, or even distortions by artificially inflating the carbon floor price or the cost of producing energy in different ways. That these are all types of distortion, and they are anti-competitive if they actually can be demonstrated to have a negative effect on competition. So there's that aspect of it, and the other aspect of it is obviously free trade, and is obviously the idea of lowering tariff barriers on products that are environmental goods, and that's an agenda that is a lot easier to push forward. Fewer people will object to lowering tariffs on environmental goods. But that's also one part of ensuring. What's the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is to have a pro-competitive market that is of sufficient size that it can deliver better prices, more choice, all of these things that competitive markets do around the world. And certainly this is something that and the final thing I'll say on this before we get into a discussion is the UK government certainly is aware of these kinds of issues, and the advantage of the UK on these issues is it's obviously very rare to have a major G7 economy that's sort of embarking on independent trade policy for the first time in 50 years. Probably will never see this again. It's an opportunity, and what I've said to other countries is that the way you should look at the UK's process here is precisely that. It's a major G7 that's adopted trade policy, and a lot of things that have been very difficult to push in the global context or in the WTO context. You may have a willing partner that's willing here to try new things, to adapt to new ideas, and push this forward. Now, on the other hand, the negative side of this is that it's not entirely clear at this point which side of the table the UK will actually land on. We're having a vigorous debate in the UK in the agricultural context about whether the UK is going to adopt essentially and retain European agricultural regulation, which has put the EU on the other side of most countries in the WTO. Is the UK going to be a sort of mini version of the EU, or is it actually going to be doing something different and more trade liberalizing and more consistent with its WTO obligations in that area? So, and of course, in the environmental area, we have COP21 coming. There is as you all know, there is a very powerful environmental movement in the UK. So I think you will see in the UK, aside from the trade policy agenda, some drive and move from certain UK government entities, particularly DEFRA, but particularly the Department for the Environment and Food and Rural Affairs. They will be moving to perhaps do some unilateral things in the environmental space, perhaps look at things like border tax adjustments and so forth. And in the context of the overall WTO framework on those sorts of things, particularly the TBT agreement, coming up with reasonable, viable alternatives to these proposed unilateral mechanisms will be really important. So any ideas that you as a group have on what those reasonable alternatives are that help you nevertheless achieve your goal, you achieve your legitimate environmental objective, those will be really, really important. And if they're available and they're ignored, that could ground a WTO violation, because the country doing it will not be able to then rely on the exemptions that exist in the WTO GATT framework for things like protecting human and plant health, or, for example, protecting natural resources and that type of thing. So the idea of the distortion mechanism is both a sword and a shield to ensure a competitive market. So I'll stop there, and happy to have a discussion about this.
Thanks very much, Shankar. I mean, I think right now we're going to try and move on with a couple of other inputs to the conversation from other esteemed participants. And I'll start actually with Ronald Steenbleck, who is at ISD, if Ronald's on the call, who is an expert in environment and trade, and has been deeply involved in the ACCTS, which is an agreement among a number of nations to seek to reduce barriers to trade in environmental goods and services, and reduce, for example, subsidies to fossil fuels. So maybe, Ron, you could quickly take us through the ACCTS, and in the context of these impediments to trade, maybe describe how the ACCTS will function, and especially its relationship to the WTO, for example, and compliance with rules there.
Thank you very much, Julian. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep. And thanks to Rod and Hallie and everybody else for the opportunity to speak here. Just to give me an idea how many minutes you want me to speak, I wasn't told that.
I mean, if you could do it in 5, that would be great.
Okay, I'll try to. All right. So just a little bit of background. There have been attempts to liberalize trade in environmental goods and services going way back, and you may be familiar with Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. That forum tried in the late 1990s to come up with a list of environmental goods and fast track elimination of tariffs on that. They couldn't get agreement. And so they went to the WTO, and there were other countries interested, and so the WTO said, okay, we'll do this. And they combined it with also environmental services, but that was what's called the Doha round. That failed, and then finally in the early part of this past decade, the APEC members came back to it and said, okay, we'll develop a shorter list, and we'll agree to set 5% ad valorem tariff maximum on the goods. But meanwhile, then after that, there was another attempt at what's called a plurilateral negotiation for something called an environmental goods agreement, and that involved China, the United States, the EU, Canada, Japan, most of the big players, and it got very, very close, and there was a long list of almost 300 goods, but that failed, and it fell over bicycles. Well, that precipitated it. Yeah, no, I mean, there's a lot of protectionist interest against bicycles, unfortunately. So right here, it's uncontroversial. It's still controversial. But so then what was really interesting, and I was involved in some of the early discussions on this, was that New Zealand in particular, working with other countries that it's worked on in other forums to promote climate-friendly and trade policies, we decided that maybe instead of taking a kind of a top-down approach of really involving all of the major countries first, what in the old days they used to call the Quad, and we would say the Quad plus China, that maybe the best approach would be to get some small countries, like-minded countries together, and start small and then build out. In a sense, that's what the TPP did. That started with an agreement between New Zealand and Singapore, and then expanded out. Unfortunately, the United States backed out, just at the point where they could have been the leader in this. But that's a whole other story. So it started out with a proposal last September involving Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland, New Zealand, and Norway, and in January or February, Switzerland joined it. So they have 4 areas that they're negotiating: eliminating tariffs on environmental goods, making binding commitments on trade and environmental services, creating new disciplines to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, and then a little bit more wonky one, develop guidelines for voluntary eco-labeling programs and associated mechanisms. That's a special concern for New Zealand because they've been hit by things like food mile labeling. So they were supposed to start the negotiations in February, but thanks to COVID, they get delayed. They have the first negotiations in June, and I believe that they're at the moment having the second negotiations, at least on the fossil fuel subsidies part of it, which is what I'm following the most closely at the moment. The idea is to get some kinds of agreements on all of these 4 areas, and then reopen it to other countries to join. My understanding, I'm not 100% sure on this, is that the UK may be participating, or maybe may have sent somebody as an observer to the negotiations, but the actual formal members are still just this 6. You know, once they start, they want to get something concrete and not end up with expanding it too much and then not having an agreement at the end. They'll probably build on the lists that were done for the environmental goods agreement, lists of environmental goods. For environmental services, it'll probably be some kind of agreement to make binding commitments on most favored nation, national treatment agreements, and a few other things like that, at least initially. On subsidies, it's probably the most difficult one. Only 2 of the countries, Norway and New Zealand, are significant producers of fossil fuels, I mean, relative to their economies. The other ones may have some small tax exemptions or other kinds of support for fossil fuels, but it's really a New Zealand, Norway thing. So that's probably used up in my 5 minutes, but anyway, the idea is eventually to try to get more and more countries interested, and the countries that I think will be the most easy to bring on, particularly for environmental goods and fossil fuels, is small island nations, which are also, of course, the nations that are most vulnerable to rising seas and climate change, and that's in hurricanes and other effects of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronald. That's really helpful. Gives some great context. I think if Roberto Salinas is here, he mentioned a kind of neat idea that he's been working on. Roberto, I see you. That looks at creating a sort of free trade area on the Mexico-US border. Roberto, so just quick background, Roberto's a leading free market advocate in Mexico, being involved in kind of free market advocacy for many years, and now runs the Atlas Foundation's Latin American initiative. That's the right term, but anyway, Roberto, you could explain yourself if you want. Otherwise, just maybe you could explain your proposal.
Yes, thank you, Julian. It's wonderful to be part of this extremely interesting and educational conversation. It's not a topic that I'm terribly familiar with, except from the policy vantage point. And as Julian was saying, I have the opportunity now with Atlas Network to be part of the Center for Latin America. Another colleague of ours is here today. Gonzalo Schwartz has also been very involved, and of course Guillermo Peña Panting, whom we heard from him earlier, is also a very important driver of the different ideas that we try and propose. So part of the whole nature of focusing on free market policies, open market policies for clean energies, is in part to try and seize the narrative, or rather place the narrative concerning renewable energies and clean energies in a different light. Why? Because so far it is the, let us say, the statist point of view that has seized this narrative and has taken this flag as its own, with our own equivalents of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal and whatnot. So I think this is a marvelous opportunity as far as the optics are concerned to change the narrative and change the debates and introduce some real honest to goodness investment, private investment or productive investment driven policies to that effect. Now, what I think is extremely interesting to note is part of the change in mentality and in outlook that has occurred as a result of full-scale trade and investment integration between two countries that over 25 years ago, it was thought this was impossible. Mexico, the United States, and Canada were the three countries in the context of the North American Free Trade Agreement, and now rebranded USMCA. Back then, in the early 90s, it was thought it's impossible for trade at such scale. Even Paul Craig Roberts, a pro-free market advocate, would say this is not going to work because of the enormous asymmetries, economic asymmetries that exist between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Yet the facts tell us something very different. And part of what has occurred is that Mexico has gone from a commodity-based country into a manufacturing, a very large manufacturing sector. A lot of these facts aren't known. But my point is that as a result of this paradigm shift in economics driven by free trade and driven by a free trade agreement negotiated by the three parts, the number one driver of competitiveness today is seen as affordable and reliable energy. And this has produced a whole euphoria concerning the possibilities of investment in solar energies and in aeolic energies, to the extent that a group, I wasn't involved in the group, I've promoted it, but I wasn't involved in the original research, but a group of engineers spearheaded originally by Luciano Castillo at Purdue University. I happen to be a graduate of Purdue, so I'm doubly proud of that fact. Put together a proposal that instead of focusing on a wall between the United States and Mexico, why not focus on an investment-driven region that is conformed of solar and wind farms throughout the entire border, and that is completely private investment driven. Not 1 cent, not even the need for any specific tax policy to spur this type of investment. And this, I think, is the type of out-of-the-box initiatives that would come a very long way, first, to capture the narrative of clean energies on our side, and second, to lend credence and credibility to the idea of how such trade agreements can spur the investment conditions, create the investment conditions for something as far-reaching as imagining such an important border zone between Mexico and the United States, to encompass a whole clean energy field that can not only generate jobs, that can not only generate investment, that can also secondarily address security concerns, because of course it's going to be it's a private investment. It's private investment that is financing these different projects, but also create exactly what the very large manufacturing expansion across the border requires, which is access to long-term, affordable and reliable energy inputs. Today, there's an onslaught in Mexico, given our new populist government headed by Manuel López Obrador, to turn back and go back to the 1970s, the 1980s, the idea of electricity sovereignty, of energy sovereignty. And I think that our president in Mexico and many of his advisors have not realized that he's locked in at a regional level with a trade agreement to rather try and start thinking about how to spur investment rather than remonopolize the electricity and the energy markets. So I think it's something very much that we should very much look forward to. what I will do, Julian and Rod, what I will do is I will paste the link of the original article where I found this, and I've written a great deal about it. But I think it's this type of out of the box thinking that can go a long way to give credibility and to give substance to clean capitalism.
Roberto, if I may weigh in, Julian. Roberto, thank you very much. We're really, really honored to have Atlas Network here. I have to say, Smith Richardson Foundation was one of the founding donors that helped Atlas get started way back when in the 1980s. So we're very pleased to have you in here. And I really want everybody to understand, that Atlas is a tremendous organization that links together over 500 free market think tanks around the world. So if we come up with good ideas that have international applications, this is a network where you can gain, 500, voices, or, well, at least some those that are interested, can help promote these ideas around the world.
Yes.
So this is a very powerful network that Roberto is, representing here today, and I'm very pleased to have such genuine free market thinkers at the table, who have been missing in previous climate and environmental discussions too often. But I must say that we're running a little bit behind, and what we're going to do because of that is that we will go a little bit longer, just to be flexible. We're going to be a little bit outside the box. If people cannot, if some of the key participants can't stay on longer than 4, let me know, and we will put you in advance of the agenda, if possible.